First of all, I have to make an announcement of correction, because I don't like the title indoor tanning. I'd rather like to talk about indoor insolation, because it opens a broader range, and I think there's much more about UV and sunlight than just tanning. So the first slide gives us an idea what we and our ancestors could get from the sun. We get orientation, vision, space, time, religion, culture. The culture and the religion told our ancestors how to face the sun, how to deal with the sun in terms of light hygiene and light diet, with the purpose to benefit from the influence, to gain health, to stay healthy. And this is what many of us today get from the sun. We lose a lot of aspects which could be beneficial to our biological nature, and this is mainly due to bashing of sunlight, which is kind of stream in the last decades that, for example, dermatologists, but other groups who are interested in our, biology, telling us that we should stay apart, away from the sun, that we should be careful, especially with ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is able to induce cancer cells in our tissue, and we all should cover ourselves up with sun protection creams and avoid the sun wherever it's possible. But this used to be different in other ages. In most other elderly cultures, we had a kind of sun worshipping, and we don't have to look back to ancient Egypt. The last age of sun worshipping existed in our environment less than 100 years ago. And this is what I want to start with. If you were living in the past, let's say 100 years ago, this often meant that you had to suffer from diseases of darkness, especially from tuberculosis or rickets. And the reason for the development of these diseases of darkness were the industrialization, burning of coal, which prevented sunlight from shining through onto people living in the cities. And so what people empirically found out these days, that the children, they became sick, they developed diseases like rickets, and not only the children, most of the people living in the cities, in blocks like you can see here, they never saw the sunlight in a pure and clean condition. It always was filtered by the smog layers above the cities, and so the diseases of darkness, they had a good chance to have their impact on a good number of the population. Here you can see on the left hand the breed of a family with rickets. You can see that there's a deformation of the bones. The bone health is affected, and in more severe cases there was even tetanic cramps. These children, they were sick from the very beginning of their lives, and because they didn't know the true reason for this disease, there was no cure. On the right side, you can see the tuberculosis bacteria and an advertisement against tuberculosis. These two diseases were the most important diseases of darkness, and the next slide shows you the guy who received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1903, mainly for inauguration of the phototherapy of a skin type of tuberculosis. And when you think back these 100 plus years, it was the time where it was not easy to fight infection, for example, because the antibiotics were not available. They haven't been found these days. So biophysical means increasing blood circulation, warming up the tissue, and exposing the patients to sunlight was a good idea, and it was the work of Niels Ryberg-Finsen created, we could say today, a kind of medical hype throughout the civilized society. And what Finsen found out were these three basic principles: that light can penetrate the skin, so you reach the deeper layers where the tuberculosis bacteria were present. And since Downs and Blunt's experiments, scientists would knew that light, especially short wavelength light, can kill bacteria, and that light is able to set the skin into a specific kind of inflammation. So the penetration, bactericidal properties, and the incitement of the skin, these three pillars were, in Finsen's thinking, the reason why he could use it as a therapeutic in tuberculosis. And the next slides, they look a little bit strong, but you can see what Finsen was able to reach using the ultraviolet light on his patients. This is a skin manifestation of tuberculosis called lupus vulgaris, and it's like a wolf had bitten you right in the face, and it was socially discriminating if people suffered from this lupus vulgaris. And you can see before Finsen treatment and after Finsen treatment, he was able to achieve quite cosmetically good results compared to the other therapeutic options they had in these days. Surgery, use of X-rays were devastating regarding the cosmetic result. Another example for the lupus vulgaris treatment, and on the next slide you can see how Finsen used the sunlight. The nurses he called Lichtelfen or light elves. They had to hold specific handles, and the sunlight was concentrated or focused through quartz glass lenses in order to kill the bacteria in the deeper layers of the tissue. And to get deeper, he had to press away the blood in the tissue layers using these compressorien or compressive units. You can also see that they could be linked to a water irrigation system in order to cool the tissue and not to bring thermal skin burn into the field. But the problem was that in Denmark, where Finsen performed his kind of specific therapy, due to lack of natural sunlight, he only could treat people for on 30 days throughout the whole year. But he had much more patients to treat. So in fact, he was the first to inaugurate the creation of electrical kind of sunlight extraction. He used an arc light, an electrical arc light, which had significant amounts, which produced significant amounts of ultraviolet radiation. In later times, the quartz lamp based on mercury discharge, which was invented in 1905, 1906 by Küch in Germany, was even more fitting for UV treatment against tuberculosis. And the Finsen inaugurated light hype promoted the heliotherapy, for example, in the Swiss mountain heights. And August Rollier, he was the Nestor, or the most important man to perform the heliotherapy, the use of natural sunlight, for about 50 years, from the early years in the 20th century up to the middle of the 20th century. And to give you an idea what diligent use of sunlight is able to achieve in the tuberculosis patients, this was not the skin type of tuberculosis. This little guy had a systemic tuberculosis form, and you can tell by these slides that he wouldn't have survived the next few weeks. But already after 6 months of diligent heliotherapy, you can tell it's the same guy, it's the same boy, and he survived just by the use, by the proper use, the well-dosed use of sunlight. Here you can see him after 2.5 years, skiing, mostly naked, so the therapy was kept. And another 15 and 23 years, you can see the same guy in a very good condition. So it was not a first shot stuff. It was a thorough treatment with long-term positive results. So this was the chapter Sunlight and Electric Ultraviolet Light Against Tuberculosis. By the way, tuberculosis, do you have any idea about the percentage of tuberculosis throughout the world nowadays? There are some sad estimates claiming that nearly 30% of the world population still is infected by tuberculosis germs. Yes. And these germs are not treatable that easy because we have summed up resistance by the poor use of antibiotics. So in a way it's still a topic, it's still an aspect of today, as well as the rickets. If we would not treat our little babies, our newborn babies, with vitamin D preparations, they would develop rickets in the same way they did 100 years ago. What I would like to point out is the work of Kurt Hulczynski. He was the first, he was a pediatric physician in Berlin, and in around 1920 he made an experiment with a child suffering from rickets. He tonated one arm with the quartz lamp, which produces high intensities of UV, and made X-ray controls of the bone health improvement. And what he found out is that the untreated arm showed improvement as well. So he concluded, okay, I treat this arm with the quartz lamp and both arms and the whole system improves. There must be a substance which is most probably transported by blood circulation, which acts in the whole system after a local treatment. And this was the moment when the scientists started to find out more about this magical substance which was able to cure rickets. And when we look at the solar spectrum, this little part of the spectrum is responsible for the positive action. It's in the UVB, and some early action spectra curves for the vitamin D photosynthesis you can see here on this slide. It's mostly around 300 nanometers wavelength that the light produces this anti-rachitic effect. And Adolf Windaus, he won the Nobel Prize in 1928. He unlocked the secret of vitamin D synthesis and provided the scientific basis for activities, industrial activities like these. You can see a yeast irradiation system. In these days, they were thrilled by enhancing the concentration of vitamin D of natural substances using UV irradiation. So yeast could be irradiated in order to concentrate up the vitamin D. In yeast, here you see a milk irradiation system in the milk central processing area in Frankfurt. So it was quite widespread to concentrate or to provide the vitamin D to the population in order to fight tuberculosis, to fight these diseases of darkness. And it was widespread and common to treat children, even in a group treatment. Here you can see one kind of lamp, and another example for group treatment. This is the way to the pithead bath flanked by quartz lamps. In minery, the miners, they were far apart from sunlight most of the time throughout the day, and in order to keep them well and keep them fit and increase their performance, they had, when they were naked on the way to the pithead bath, they had to go through this pathway and were irradiated from front and back using, for example, the Osram Ultra Vitalux lamps, UV producing lamps which increased the photosynthesis in their skin. Another example is the central mountain sun, or Zentralhöhensonne, another product from Hanauer künstliche Höhensonne. But as ever, the way of life is that everything goes in kind of circles, and this pendulum shall serve as a kind of symbol. If we are too euphoric about something, things might turn around. And this happened with the vitamin D hype in these days. Unfortunately, some researchers unintentionally intoxicated a group of children by administering insanely high doses of vitamin D. And this was a kind of tipping point when the pendulum changed its direction, swinging reversely for some decades. And most of the physicians just forgot about the importance of vitamin D. What stayed in their mind, it's maybe dangerous, you can intoxicate yourself, so they forgot about it. They didn't test their patients, they just ignored this substance for decades. And another aspect, for sure, after the Second World War, the pharmaceutical companies, they gained ground. It was the dawn of the age of antibiotics. And many biophysical methods like the UV light therapy were abandoned. And so this led to situation we are in nowadays, that it's just for several years that the topic of vitamin D deficiency gains ground again, and that we know that in the meantime that vitamin D not only is important for bone health, it also helps to prevent infections. We can enhance our performance by, if we have enough vitamin D in our system. We even have chronobiological effects. In my opinion, the vitamin D is a seasonal chronobiological substance, a seasonal stress hormone. We have the circadian stress hormones, and the vitamin D as the seasonal stress hormone just sets the switches between heating and cooling. These are some of the tasks for the winter-summer living. In winter we have to heat our system, in summer we have to cool it down, we have to change the amount of water in our bloodstream, and so on and so on. It can act as an antidepressant and much more. I think you will learn and already read about the importance of vitamin D in other lectures and read about it in books. And to answer this big question, maybe we can't really answer it, but there are some aspects I want to share with you so you can build your own picture and your own opinion about this issue. The oral application of vitamin D is in fact independent from sunlight, it's independent from ultraviolet radiation. It's more or less available all seasons, but if we all would take one 20,000 unit pill now and would take a blood test now and before you ingested it, and let's say in 10 days, I bet we all would have a different gain and a different effect. So it depends on the body mass, it depends on our age, how much vitamin D we in fact can bring into our blood by oral ingestion. And the blood testing definitely is required. There is another distribution pattern of the orally ingested vitamin D. I call this lipoprotein galenics. And the consequence of this galenics is a shorter half-life compared to the skin synthesis of vitamin D. This depends on sunlight. It depends on especially ultraviolet B radiation, which is not available throughout the year. It's not available in winter. So we have to take care to step out into the sun with the whole body, during the right time during the day. If you step out into the sun in the late afternoon, it will even decrease your vitamin D and not build up additional vitamin D. So if we use artificial UV radiation, we have a better dose control because we cannot see and feel from just staring at the sun. We don't know anything about the UVB concentration because we don't have senses to detect them. But we can still rely on the natural processes in our body, because the vitamin D, which is produced within our skin, does not require any blood testing because it's kind of self-regulating. There is no overdosage. In opposite to the lipoprotein galenics, you can read the DBP galenics, which means debinding protein. There is a specific protein which is made for transporting the vitamin D in our bloodstream. It's called debinding protein. And this might be the reason for a longer half-life. of the vitamin D which has been produced under the influence of radiation in our skin. To understand the mechanisms better, I want to introduce the actors. We have the cholesterol, which is a very crucial substance to building membranes, to build up membranes in our cells. A derivative from cholesterol is the 7-dehydrocholesterol. It's the precursor of the vitamin D in our skin, in the squamous cell layer of the epidermis. And after the influence of ultraviolet B has taken place, this precursor molecule changes by kind of rotational movement into calciol, which then is absorbed by the debinding protein and distributed within the body. On the left side of the slide you see this round-shaped ball-like structure. This is a lipoprotein. It's a simple lipid transporter molecule, and you see the skin, of course, in the middle as the playground of all these processes. The basics of vitamin D synthesis: we need the UVB from sunlight. This changes the dehydrocholesterol into pre-vitamin D, which is absorbed into the bloodstream, transformed into the calcidiol molecule within the liver, and the kidney produces the active calcitriol molecule, or it deactivates the hormone in the bloodstream into the 24-25 dihydroxy cholecalciferol. So the kidney in the end controls the concentration in the bloodstream, but we have other sites and tissue types where we can find the transformation from the precursor calcidiol into the active hormone. The cholesterol transforms into dehydrocholesterol, which you can compare with a kind of specific mousetrap. It's a spring-loaded molecule waiting for the ultraviolet B irradiation impulse, and here again this debinding protein. The mousetraps are most highly concentrated in the spinous, in the layer of the epidermis, where we have these cells, the keratinocytes, which then transform into the corneocytes. So the radiation has to pass through the epidermis and to reach this layer to activate the mousetraps. We have the debinding protein in the serum, in the plasma, in the bloodstream. It acts like a magnet which draws and pulls the hormone, the activated molecule into the bloodstream. And now I can see I didn't translate these slides, I'm sorry for that. But if you take vitamin D orally, it mostly is transported by the lipoproteins, and when you produce it in your skin, it's mainly transported via the debinding protein. And the lipoprotein transportation, it's like standard mail, and the debinding protein, it's a kind of express mail. So it's a very specific mail which takes care that your package ends at the addressee. So I'm sorry, the next slide still is in German. It's the summary that the effect is not the same if you take the vitamin D orally or you produce it within your skin. I already described the different galenics. So maybe the best prophylaxis of the lack of sunlight, of the civilizational anheliosis, is to go out into the sunlight. But there are a lot of aspects why this is not possible for everyone, and it's not so easy. We would have to measure the intensity, the UV index and so on, and we have to set up a timer that we don't overdo it, because what we always should avoid is, of course, a sunburn. So the medical UV cabinets are able to produce, to replace the natural sunlight, but now we have, is it really a shocking legislation, the UV-Schutzverordnung, restrictions which control the output intensity of cosmetic tanning beds? Do we have less tanning? Do we have impacts on vitamin D at all? These are questions we only can answer when we do experiments. Here you can see the changes in vitamin D concentration in a trial I performed with 80 volunteers. The lower curve you can see from the control group, it decreased. They decreased throughout the 8 weeks of the experiment in vitamin D concentration, and all 3 groups with the tanning bed use, with the standard tanning bed 0.3 watts per square meter tanning bed, they increased in vitamin D concentration. So if someone claims that standard tanning beds cannot produce or induce vitamin D production, this is the proof that they can, in fact. And the most significant effects were in those clients or volunteers who started with a very low concentration. They had increases of more than 100% within, let's say, 2 weeks. Another aspect, I think, which is very interesting, we asked the volunteers, do they use tanning beds on a regular basis, or sometimes, or only rarely, or never? And we found the lowest concentration in those who never used tanning beds. And we started with our investigation in January last year in order to avoid interferences from the natural sun. So this was the typical time where you diagnose a vitamin D deficiency, when the year has started. But I don't want to look only, you might have noticed that we are already in the present, the past we've left behind. And I just want to point out that it's not only the ultraviolet radiation which is beneficial to our skin, to our organism. All the different parts of the solar spectrum can be advantageous if used diligently. And the visible part and the infrared A, the near-infrared part, they are new areas for developments, because when you think of a standard tanning bed, the visible part remains invisible. Why? You should use goggles or protection glasses, so the visible part is of no use as long as you have ultraviolet radiation coming along with the visible radiation. So we need different units if we want to take the advantage of the effects of visible irradiation and near-infrared irradiation as well. Some of the advantages of the longer wavelengths can be deciphered from this chart. We have a much higher penetration depth compared to the ultraviolet radiation, and so we're able to activate blood circulation, we are able to activate tissue remodeling skin rejuvenation effects using the longer wavelengths. And now, in a way, this is still part of the present, but it will give us an idea into the direction of the future. When we just look at a melanocyte, then we can learn from the papers which have been published during the last 5 years that it's a guy who's responsible for much more than tanning, and he's depending on much more signals than just ultraviolet light. They even are able to react upon visible light. They have pigments, photopigments as we find them in our eye. They have an inner clock, so it might play a certain role at which time of the day or during the night we try to address him, for example, to produce pigments. So if we learn how the melanocyte interacts with the cell types around him, the keratinocytes, cells from the connective tissue and so on, we will be able to manufacture much better units, because we can, when we know how to diligently use the full spectrum artificially, then we can reduce the dose for certain wavelengths, especially for the UV, and still achieve better effects. Chronobiology is one aspect. We can only take advantage when we are using radiation which gets in contact with our eyes, with the retinal structures. If we look at the UVA radiation, for example, so it's not only UVB we need for producing the vitamin D. The blood circulation within the skin plays a crucial role, for example, for the intake of the photosynthesized substances. So if we are able to increase the blood circulation in the outer layers of the skin, we have a better resorption for the photosynthesized substances. And here the UVA enters the stage. Ultraviolet A radiation stimulates the production of nitric oxide, for example, which is an enhancer, a natural enhancer for blood circulation. And there are some papers available which prove or which demonstrate that we can lower the systemic blood pressure by using ultraviolet A for radiation purposes. The next slide shows what we can do with natural sunlight. This is a measurement, a spectral measurement of good sunlight after it passed through a window glass. The modern climate controlling glasses, they take apart important spectral ranges from natural sunlight, or in other words, we can make a bad artificial light out of natural sunlight if we are sitting behind a window glass. So it's very probable that in the future we will have more artificial light, but still we are living, or our body is living, in a kind of biological darkness, because most people in the civilized nations, they have no chance to step out into the sunlight for sufficient times. More or less we are 90% indoors in the meantime, so the sunlight deficiency is pre-programmed, and this is a field for development of artificial sunlight which meets more than just one action spectrum. The key word would be closer to the sun. On this slide you see a summary: indirect pigmentation, direct pigmentation, reactive oxygen species generation, vitamin D synthesis, photobiomodulation, which means controlling the matrix remodeling processes. Water kinetics talks about diffusion processes which can be enhanced, improved microcirculation, photovasorelaxation. So if we deliver spectral energy to all of these different processes which occur in our skin, we are already in the future, and I think this is the direction to go for the future, for artificial insulation, learning more about the subtle processes and delivering energy in a diligent way so that we can increase the health of people who are, due to a lot of different circumstances, not able to benefit from the natural sunlight. Okay, this was my part for this presentation. Now, thank you for your kind attention.